I want to begin in a minute or so by looking at what the world would have looked like from the various foreign ministries or chancelleries of the great powers in the middle to the end of the 1890s. But it's worth making the point right at the beginning that the world was already a very, very different place from what it had been even 50 years before. So just imagine it in terms of the growth of mass society. Huge increases in communication, second industrial revolution, electricity, the first brands, overseas expansion. That the world was more global. This is the first period of globalization 1.0. And also a period of national growth and nationalities. Louis Namier, in a famous essay called The Seed Plot of History, wrote about 1848, that the incursion of the idea of ethnicities as the basis for nation states was bound to cause confusion and a great deal of uncertainty, rather than on polities based on political arrangements such as Britain and the United States, and indeed France. The world that those diplomats had come into would probably have been recognizable, certainly at the time of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic War. It might even have been recognizable at the time of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1848, which ended the 30 Years' War and established the principle of national sovereignty and the territorial integrity of countries. Of course, this didn't stop people invading other countries, but it was recognised that this was the pursuit of one national interest against another. So we have Frederick the Great taking over Silesia to begin the 7 Years' War. We have the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. At least until that generation, the language of diplomacy was still French. It's recorded that the first British Foreign Minister to talk to his ambassadors in English was Edward Grey, just before the First World War. So it was a commonality of the balance of power. The balance of power in Europe was supposed to prevent one single one of the powers becoming too dominant. So the idea was there would be a shifting coalition to prevent one power becoming too important. All this began to change in the 1890s. So if you were in Rome, well, the first thing would be that you were no longer in Turin, because after the unification of Italy, but also in 1871, after the French left the Vatican City, Rome became the capital. What would the Italian Foreign Office be interested in? Well, the first thing would be they were just about clinging on to having a seat at the table. They hardly compared with the other powers of Europe. They'd still have territorial claims on Austria-Hungary, Trieste and Trentino. They would have an eye on the Dalmatian coast. They were disabused of any influence in Tunisia by the French, but succeeded in Libya. They had a disaster, the first European colonial power to be defeated in Africa in 1896 at Dadaw in Abyssinia. And they possibly had this status primarily because of their strategic position in the Mediterranean, rather than because of any economic power. Austria-Hungary was clinging on by its fingernails. It was frozen out of Germany after its defeat in 1866. Primacy of Germany was established. It was in strong competition with Russia in the Balkans. Significantly, it was the only great power to be exclusively interested in Europe. It had no pretensions to be global. And it had the significant problem of insurgencies in the nation states, particularly in the Balkans. Croats, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, Ruthenes, the list goes on. So it was a source of great instability. Outside Europe, we have to introduce to the European balance of power Japan. Japan had rapid modernization since the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and had subsequently defeated first China and then Russia in 1905, which had a huge impact on the balance of power not only in the Far East, but also of Russia in Europe. It was interested in South Korea and was also in alliance with Great Britain, something which I'll return to at the very end. France was still traumatized by the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Prussia in 1871. It was constantly concerned that it would be attacked again by Germany. And in every single sphere, in economic, military and political terms, the possible exception of Paris's cultural supremacy over Berlin, it was subordinate to German power in Central Europe. It was also driven by social conflict, expressed not only through the Dreyfus affair in the 1890s, but in the balance of French society. The story is that in every French village there was a battle between the schoolteacher and the priest, between the secular republic and Holy Mother Church. So a society which was very much driven. It had been successful at the Congress of Berlin, which divided up Africa in 1884, and so it did have non-European aspirations. Russia was also developing very, very fast industrially, but in very tight locations, particularly in what was then Petersburg and Moscow, and had had a century-long expansion into Central Europe and the Far East, knocking at the door of Afghanistan and potentially threatening the British rule in India. It was seen to be an extensive military power, but the population of Russia was overwhelming, but its military organization was relatively weak. And it also had an interest in the South Slavs, in the Balkans, and a search for a warm water port, whether that be Constantinople, Istanbul, or in the Far East, the city which was called Port Arthur, and which is now the Chinese city of Dalian in the northeast of China. Germany wanted a place in the sun. It was conscious of always potentially having to fight a war on two fronts. If you look at any map of Europe, you can see the problem. If any of you have ever played diplomacy or risk, you can see the problem. Germany's in the middle, France is here, Russia is there. The very central element of German foreign policy. It was disappointed in Africa, despite having the third largest empire in Africa, and it had massive industrial potential, both actual and potential, and also interested in prizing open the Far East. The Chinese city of Qingdao, halfway between Shanghai and Tianjin, was colonized by the Germans, and you can still see the influence of German architecture and the influence of German beer, Qingdao beer, one of the better beers in China. United States of America, a continental size. The resolution of the American Civil War in 1865 and the Union Railway that went across united a whole continent, a continental size power, and completely separate from the rest of the world, except in terms of its growing influence. 1898, Spanish-American War, the control of Cuba, the occupation of the Philippines. So United States is announcing itself as a potential global power. And finally, Great Britain, the empire on which the sun never sets, both chronological, because somewhere in the world the sun would be shining on British territory, but also the idea that it would go on forever, which of course it didn't. It was still concerned with France and Russia, traditionally not traditional opponents of British rule, but increasingly, and if you were having your cup of tea on a Friday afternoon or your first gin and tonic in the British Foreign Office, you were beginning to think much more seriously about Germany and the United States. The point I want to emphasize before looking at some of the demographic and economic background to this is that Britain preeminently was the global power. Global in the sense that it had influence or territory or trade with every single part of the world, and was increasingly interested in its global situation, not only in commodity trading, but in the export of capital. I think the foreign direct investment surpassed domestic investment in Britain as early as 1861. And the patterns of that investment were changing. In the period in the 1860s, 36% was to the empire. By just before the First World War, it was 46%. Latin America from 10.5 to 22, and the United States, it began to decline from 27% to 19%. They were the significant things. So the empire was becoming increasingly important for the maintenance of British rule. Not exclusively, still more investment in the informal empire in Latin America than there would have been in African colonies, for fairly obvious reasons in terms of markets. But the shift was happening very, very dramatically. So Britain's position as a global power was the one which they were most clearly determined to hold on to, because of the emerging threats or the clouds of Germany and the United States, with Germany being more in the forefront. At this time, there was actually discussion among the imperialist section of the British ruling class about an alliance with the United States. Perhaps you can indicate, something indicates that is the response of Rudyard Kipling to the Spanish-American War, the famous or infamous poem, The White Man's Burden, where he talks about the unity of the Anglo-Saxon races. This was a particular attribute of sections of the imperialist thinkers, like Cecil Rhodes, for example, who founded the scholarships which attracted American students to Britain. I want to talk briefly about the economic and demographic factors which give an indication of the relative power of some of these countries. And I want to put this in the context of a quotation which has already been used once and another one. And I don't mean to suggest that there is a straight trajectory between economics and politics. There are many mediations, but I'm reminded of a quotation of an old man called Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who made the point that politics is concentrated economics. And then you move from that quotation to the one that's been talked about twice already from Clausewitz, that war is diplomacy by other means. So the ability to fight a war, as well as the need to fight a war in defence of your national interests, is established by that relationship, although there are many, many twists and turns. So what we're looking at in this period is the misalignment of political and economic power. In the same way that we can discuss after the Second World War, or particularly after the financial crisis, 7-8, that we see that the economic power of China is not represented in the political sphere. At this period of time, the economic power of Germany, and indeed the United States, was not properly represented in the political sphere. And it was real power. Just to give you a couple of examples. These are very old-fashioned, but they will be applied at the time. For example, German coal production in 1850, when it would have been Prussia, was 6 million tonnes. By 1914, it was 277 million tonnes. In Britain, 57 in 1850, 292 million in 1914. And in the United States, nothing in 1850 and 455 million tonnes by 1914. The figures for Britain and Germany are quite similar. Britain seems to be ahead, but you have to take into account that a lot of British coal was actually exported. It wasn't used in British manufacturing, in production. It was exported as a commodity. So already Germany was more powerful in that basic factor. And the same, I haven't got probably the time to do it, but you can get the same sort of picture from pig iron production. And pig iron production, of course, was then linked to steel, with Germany ahead of Britain by 1914, but only half the amount of the United States. Similar things happened in the new industries, chemicals, potash, synthetic dyes, in which Germany was more dominant and increasingly dominant compared with Britain. I've got just one figures for population here, if I can find them. Yeah, I've used different countries here because it represents the military potential struggle in Europe. The population of Germany in 1910 was 65 million, France 39 million, and Russia 111 million. The problem was, though, was that the French population was stagnating and the German and Russian populations were increasing much more dramatically. Finally, in terms of naval estimates and spending, military spending, the naval estimates of the great powers in Germany in 1890, 4.6 million. 1914, 22.4 million. Great Britain, 13.8 to 47.4. And Russia, surprisingly, 23.6. So a Russian navy was also a potential threat to Germany. And this was one of, jumping ahead, because since I've mentioned it now, one of the key triggers for German reaction in 1914 was that for the first time they'd, and this would have been in military intelligence, discovered that the Russian and the British Navy were going to cooperate in the Baltic. So, naval estimates going through the roof. This reflected itself in a struggle for supremacy on the seas. In 1900, Great Britain had 49 battleships. 1914, it had 64, whereas Germany had gone from 14 to 40. And technically, they were much better. Britain introduced a new form of battleship called the Dreadnought, I think in around 1906, and continued to build them very quickly. But it had the paradoxical effect of making most of the other battleships redundant because they just weren't fast enough or heavily armed enough. So Britain launched a naval arms race, but Germany was in a relatively good position in terms of being able to catch up with it. So that's a broad picture of the economic balance in those areas. Now I would like to look at what were the flashpoints and would they accelerate or recede. Anglo-French rivalry in Africa was on the decline. In fact, even though quite often in the political imagination of both countries they were the enemy of each other, they hadn't fought since 1815. In fact, they'd fought on the same side in the Crimean War of 1854-1855 in opposition to Russia. The last source of conflict was in the division of Africa, particularly in North Africa, but this was effectively settled first by the French attempted incursion in South Sudan to get a whole of a swath across underneath the Sahara, was stopped by the British at a place called Fashoda in 1898 because France was unable to assert itself militarily. Britain had in fact just recaptured the Sudan after the defeat of the religious leader, the Mahdi, at the Battle of Omdurman, 1898 also. The last cavalry charge of the British Army, when Winston Churchill was a subaltern carrying a pistol. So, after this, Britain accepted French control of Morocco in return for being given a relatively free hand in Egypt, where Britain took over the Suez Canal, although France maintained a financial interest in it. The Suez Canal, of course, being crucial. Firstly, initially, because of the route to India, and then obviously very, very quickly because of oil in the Persian Gulf. So Suez was absolutely crucial for British interests. And this led to the Entente Cordiale of 1904. As early as 1910, Sir Edward Grey, then the Foreign Secretary, made the point that all the links which had been established between Britain and France made it almost impossible for Britain not to become involved in a war if France was attacked by Germany. So this was never stated, but it was part of the diplomatic arrangements. Anglo-Russian rivalry, although by no means as reaching vanishing point like the relationship with France, was also on the decline, particularly in Central Asia and the Far East. The defeat of Russia by Japan in 1905 limited the capacity of Russia to attack or influence arrangements in British India. The Great Game, the diplomatic and spying arrangements around this period of time, characterised in Rudyard Kipling's great but often a novel accused of racism, Kim, but it's a fantastic read, also became much less fraught with Russia accepting that Afghanistan would not be anything other than a buffer zone. And in Persia, there was a division of Persia in spheres of influence between Russia in the north and Britain in the south. Incidentally, after the First World War, at the Treaty of Versailles, a Persian representative asked the British diplomat why they thought it was necessary to partition Persia in this way, and the British diplomat replied, it was in order to defend civilization. This is to a Persian. What was on the increase? First, the Balkans. This was the cockpit of competing national struggles. Greece had become independent as early as 1830, Romania, some degree of independence a generation later, but by the beginning of the 20th century, Serbia was anxious to get more territory, was attacking and trying to wrest influence from Austria-Hungary. The Macedonians were in the same boat. All of these things were simmering and attracting the attention of Austria-Hungary, desperate to hang on, and Russia attempting to get more influence in the area, to the exclusion also of Turkey. So this was increasing. There was a direct confrontation between Austria-Hungary and between Russia, with Germany tied to Austria-Hungary. Germany was tied to Austria-Hungary on the old-fashioned basis of not being isolated. It would be 2 against 3, leaving Italy aside. Austria-Hungary and Germany, Russia, France, and Britain, even though there were still attempts by the German diplomats to ensure British neutrality. And finally, already referred to, Anglo-German naval rivalry, which was becoming more intense by the year. And the way it was perceived by Britain is Britain had to have its navy everywhere in the world. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean. Germany could concentrate its navy with all of it facing Britain across the North Sea. So Winston Churchill, when he was First Lord of the Admiralty in the run-up to the First World War, made the point that it's inconceivable that Britain would allow itself to be threatened by any other navy in this instance. Now, historically, Britain, or the Royal Navy, was supposed to be bigger than all the other navies put together in order for it to maintain its global position. Already, though, there was a retreat, and the idea then was that it would be only bigger than the next 2 navies put together. And this was partly, and if you look at the documentation, this is the first time that you see the Exchequer, the Treasury, having an impact on foreign policy because of the limits of ability to spend. Even though, if you look at the figures of percentage of GDP spent by each country in the armaments one, Britain is the one which is able to spend least because of the size of the British economy, as a percentage, not as an absolute amount of money. Austria-Hungary is the one most difficult. It finds it most difficult to arm itself. So we have traditional rivalries going into decline, and we have new rivalries coming to existence and becoming more concentrated. Just on a side note on this, 2 things I think that came up. The importance of sea power was also very much recognised. James Woodhousen has made this point to me several times, and he refers to a work written, I think is in 1890, The Influence of Sea Power in History, by Alfred, I can't remember his middle name, Thane Mahan. He was actually an Admiralty figure, or whatever the American equivalent of the Admiralty was. And he wrote this book about the importance of sea power as the key to global domination. And this is in conflict with the other thesis that was mentioned this morning, the Mackinder thesis, which postulates that the power that controls the Central Eurasian landmass will become the dominant power. It's a very popular thesis in China at the moment. Come across it many times in small conferences. And you can see the applicability maybe now. America is a global power operating across continents, China as a continental power, although obviously they've got interests in the South China and East China Sea. And this is the first time that Germany exercises itself in a global thing. It's an attempt to challenge for global supremacy, not merely to be a European economy. And this is a shift. Bismarck, who had been taken out of power in 1890 by the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, his general rule was, here lies Russia, here lies France, and we are in the middle. That is my map of Africa. The rest of it doesn't matter. Yeah? But that shifted completely with German interest in not only in Africa, but of course in the Far East. So we're seeing an intensification of international rivalries, at this time on a global scale, and we're seeing an insistent set of claims from small nations wanting self-determination. Now, are we talking about contingency? Where did the war come from? Are we talking about inevitability? Well, the contingency is in which crisis caused the war. The inevitability is that there was going to be a clash. And there was also a great fear of revolution resulting from this. The Austro-Hungarians were particularly worried that if they fought a war and lost, that there would be a revolution. And this was also pooh-poohed by several people. The Austrian socialist Victor Adler made this point, said, and who would lead this revolution? Perhaps it's Mr. Bronstein sitting in the Café Central over there. For those of you who don't know, Bronstein was Leon Trotsky sitting in the Café Central in Vienna in 1914. So it didn't happen over Morocco in 1905 or Agadir 11. It didn't even happen over the Balkan Wars. But it happened after Sarajevo because this was the first time that everybody's national interests were concentrated. Yeah, Russia had no interest in supporting France in Africa. They weren't interested in that. France really couldn't matter about what happened with Russia in the Far East. But in this particular set of circumstances, everybody's interest was not in coming together in consensus, but of supporting the system of alliances. And so the result was the war. I want a very small point on the idea of Belgian neutrality. People often say that it was just an excuse, poor little Belgium. That's why Britain went in to defend Belgian rights from the Treaty of 1839. But you need to look at it in a much more longer term. Is that a central element of British foreign policy since the Elizabethan period was to prevent a leading European power controlling the Scheldt and Rhine estuaries. Because the Scheldt and the Rhine, which would take trade right into Europe, were much better places to have commercial enterprises than the Thames and London. But Thames and London worked because nobody big controlled the Scheldt and the Rhine. So it had always been an element of British foreign policy. So the idea of a German occupation of Belgium wasn't just a question of humanitarian concern. It was of vital interest to Great Britain. I want to just finish, I've got a minute or two, with a coda. You know the carnage of the First World War, but we also must remember that it didn't settle anything. It didn't settle the reconfiguration of politics with economics, which Frank referred to briefly this morning as the German question. That wasn't settled until 1945, when, through the defeat of Germany and the exhaustion of Britain, America became the hegemonic power. Or to put it another way, Krupp was outperformed by General Motors. So it was a three-way struggle for hegemony in which America emerged as a result of the defeat of Germany in Europe. So the lesson I would draw from this, if we're looking at the contemporary period, and hopefully it will change, is that this resolution of the imbalance between economic power and political power and military power took between 1890 and 1945. It took 50-odd years for the equilibrium to be re-established. The last word for the moment is that when Sir Edward Grey finally acknowledged that Britain would declare war on Germany, he looked out of his office into the streets of London and said, "The lights are going out all over Europe. They will not be lit again for some time." He was echoing the words of William Pitt the Younger after Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz in 1806, "Roll up this map of Europe. We shall not need it for some time." Thank you.